Got all this technology right. I hope so. We're really glad to be here. We scheduled this a good while back and have been anxiously looking forward to a chance to do this series with you. And I know that we don't know most of you, but there are a lot of familiar faces here too that we've met over the years, both Marty and I. And we hope over the weekend to get to know you a good deal better. Let me just give you a very brief introduction, perhaps to the two of us. Marty may add just a little bit more, but I'm an Alabama guy. I was born in the state. I was born in Tuscaloosa. Grew up mostly in Birmingham, though I had two really great years in Coleman. So I was close, not quite to Athens. But I went to the University of Alabama, and while I was there, I met my wife, Kay Hutto. And after college, the two of us moved to Atlanta in 1984. And we've worshiped there in the same congregation, lived in Atlanta now for 30 years, there in Embry Hills in Atlanta. And for the last 7.5 years or so, I've served as an elder of the congregation there. But I will say that Athens is a very special place for our family. Some of you may know that Kay's dad preached at one time here at Eastside. But for most of our married life, they lived somewhere either in Athens or close by. He preached, I know, for a number of years at the Jackson Drive congregation. And so for us as a family, we were constantly coming in and out of Athens. And all of our family have very special memories of different places and things that we did here in the city. So this is special for us. And Marty was an elder for 13 years at Embry Hill. So we've mentioned that both of us have served as elders, but Marty stepped down this past September following the passing away of his wife, Mary. And I say that, I think it's important for you to know that, in part so you understand why Marty's not serving as an elder now. It's his choice to step down. But he served in a very exemplary fashion over the years. But it also highlights something that I think is important about this series, and that's the idea of preparation, of being ready to serve. And one of the things we hope that we're able to get across this weekend, especially in our sessions tomorrow with the men, is that you don't really know all of those opportunities that God's going to give you in life to serve, and you need to be ready when the time comes. And sometimes it comes sooner, perhaps, than you may expect. And in our breakout sessions, I'll kind of share a little bit of that from my perspective to some of the men. There are a lot of purposes of our weekend study, not just that idea of preparation. I hope it impresses upon all of us a deeper idea of the importance of elders. It is God's plan for local congregations to have their own plurality of elders. And if that's God's plan, we need to understand a little more about why that is. How is it to work? Who are those men supposed to be? And we'll get across a number of those things, especially in our first session here as we introduce some of the roles of elders. And at the same time, well, let me do this. Let me just kind of show you this roadmap. This will help you a little bit. I just told this would. All right, so if I quit doing the pointer and actually do that. There we go. All right, so this is a kind of a calendar for our next few days here. You'll notice Friday, Saturday, and Sunday broken up into 3 blocks of time, the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. We'll start by just looking at what we're going to do tomorrow, because we have 2 sessions for the men. If you're coming in the morning session, we'll have 4 different lessons that we'll cram into 3 hours. This is actually part of a 6-lesson series that we developed a while back. And we would normally do them over a 6-week period, kind of one a week. But we've done this once before where we jammed all of these together. But notice these 4. The first one is the nature of the work. What is the work all about? We have 2 words here, sheep shepherding, flock shepherding. I'll explain those a little bit more later on. And then that last lesson especially focused on knowing what you're capable of and preparing. Now that's for the men on Saturday, but really we're going to cover a little bit of these things throughout. The idea of the nature of the work, we'll talk a lot about that the next 30 or so minutes as I go through some things. On Sunday morning, Marty will preach at your regular time for someone to speak. And when he does that, he's going to talk about the role of an elder or a shepherd in terms of each individual sheep. How do you shepherd the sheep which is, of course, our second lesson there that we'll cover on Saturday morning. Tonight, Marty is also going to talk for a few minutes about elders as shepherds of the whole flock. And there's a difference between leading the entire congregation and also being a leader, a spiritual leader for individuals. And then finally, on Sunday morning during the class period, I'm going to talk about what a congregation can do in terms of developing, helping men to become elders. And you can see the relationship of that to our fourth class, which is the idea of individuals making up their own mind that they want to develop, they want to become a servant in this fashion. And then also tonight, we'll have some breakout sessions. I think they'll explain a little bit more later, but some of the men, the women are in a different place, and the younger high schoolers, middle school age, and so forth in another place. Well, that's our roadmap as we go through this. And Marty and I would both be quick to say it may be a little unusual to spend this much time talking about elders. I think it's unusual for the two of us maybe even to be delivering these lessons. You're probably more accustomed when you gather together like this on the evening to have an evangelist, a preacher, come in and preach lessons on whatever the topic is. Neither one of us are full-time evangelists. We do get opportunities to speak fairly frequently, but we're not full-time evangelists. But we have served as elders, and I hope that we can offer a little bit of a personal perspective in regard to that. And another thing, too, though, because both of us have worshiped at the same congregation for 30 years where there has been a continuous period of elders, which means, if you think about it, we were there. I know I moved there when I was right out of college. And so whatever preparation that was done in my life, that congregation helped me a great deal to grow spiritually. But I know what it's like to follow elders, to follow men that I, to this day, really admire. What they did, the tone that they set, the way that they engaged and got themselves involved in my life personally, but also the entire congregation. And I hope that we can offer a little bit of that perspective as well. Not just what we've done as elders, but maybe thinking a little bit about what it meant to work alongside of those that we admired, that we thought were doing a very worthy job as elders. One other thing that occurred to us as we were coming over, so I added up our combined years, the two of us, in terms of being elders, and recognized that our combined years is less than what three of your men who serve here, if you're from Eastside, individually have served as elders. There's a great deal of collective wisdom among them, and two other men as well. And that's a little humbling for us to think about what you already have here in terms of knowledge and understanding of the topic, but we do hope to be able to offer something to you. I'd like this to be a little bit interactive. It's not quite like a classroom when you got this many folks, but the reason that we're kind of down here on the floor and you're kind of squeezed into two sections is to see if we could do a little bit of talking. If you're comfortable kind of answering a few questions, I don't have too many, but a few for you. One thing I think would be interesting to know as a group, I want you to think about how old you were the first time that you worshiped at a congregation where there were elders. And I realize that for some of you, that's probably, as far as you know, when you were born, you were brought in as a child into a congregation, maybe, where there were already elders. For a lot of folks, that's not really the case. And so I'm interested, you can think of how old were you? So I like, if you don't mind, raise your hand if you were over 50 years old the first time you worshiped at a congregation where there were elders. If there's anybody. So I'm going to guess that you still have them, right? Okay. Because I know how old you are within a year. So one of my college buddies. So how about over 40 years old before you worshiped where there were elders? 30? Someone else? How about over 20 before you worship somewhere? That would be me. Over 20. So a good number more. And so I'm going to, this may bring up a lot more hands. How many of you, as far back as you can remember, you've worshiped somewhere where there were elders? Okay. That's a tremendous blessing. And I know some of that is probably because a great number of you are from this congregation here, and I understand that with a very brief exception. I mean, there have been elders about as far back here as you can remember. And so but to realize that there are that many, there are a lot of places where this just isn't the case. And in fact, where we first put this material together was for a congregation in New Jersey that did not have elders. And they really want to. They see that pattern, they desire to have it, and they understand some of the shortfalls. So it's a wonderful thing that most of you have that experience, because it really is God's plan. And I'm going to list a number of passages that kind of quickly show some of the things the New Testament says about elders. But before I do that, I got another question for you. If I ask you to name one passage that you know of in the New Testament that talks about elders, maybe two, one or two, what's a passage that comes to mind? Kind of quickly, what comes to your mind? 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1. All right, so I'm not looking to go any farther than those. Just the first is 1 Peter 5, the first one that comes to your mind, or one of those others? Maybe first. But I would imagine a good number of you, the first thing that comes to mind is 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1. Why is that? What are those passages about? It's about the qualifications of elders, and so there's quite a lengthy thing. And whenever we talk about appointing new elders, we're going to go to those passages. We're going to talk about how those are the qualifications. And sometimes that's about all we really quickly remember. Now, there's a few others. I mean, Acts 20, there's that address of Paul. It's kind of got quite a number of verses. But if you really want to go to a place that for an extended period of verses talks about elders, those kind of come to mind. Those two passages, though, are primarily about the qualifications of someone who would serve as an elder, not really so much about the work itself. Now, there are some implications in those qualifications that would tell you a little bit about the work. For example, if you're supposed to be able to teach, that would suggest that part of the work of the elders is what? Teaching. I mean, some way or another, you're going to be instructing and doing that. So a little bit of that, but not a lot. But notice how many passages there are in the New Testament, and these aren't all of them. In fact, Marty's got a longer list. It'll come up a little bit later. I just want you to notice a number of things that are listed here. I'll put all of them up that I've got. These are a number of places where you will find elders being mentioned in the New Testament, and you get a better sense of what it was that they did. In Acts 11, it talks about monies coming to being placed into the hands of the elders, who in turn were obviously using it to be able to take care of the needs, the physical needs of some of those in the congregations where they were. In Acts 14, you've got Paul on his journeys, and he's converted people in various cities, and they appointed elders for them in every church. It's an indication of how important this role must be, that every church, every congregation ought to have elders. In Acts 15, they're dealing with a doctrinal issue. Now, I know that the apostles are there, but if you read carefully, the elders are there with them, and they're discussing and trying to decide something very important from a doctrinal matter. In Acts 20, there's two verses mentioned there, but there you've got this discussion between Paul and the elders who are in Ephesus. And so, on the one hand, again, here's a picture. Here's a congregation, a well-known congregation for us in our New Testament. They had elders. But among the verses that you find there is one that talks about them being made overseers to care for the church. So they're doing something positive for the benefit of that particular church in Ephesus. Among the things they would do that was positive, we'll come back to this passage a little bit later on, Acts chapter 21, they were guarding the unity. Here Paul had come back from some of his travels. He's back in Jerusalem. There's been some questions raised about what Paul taught, the relationship of the old law, and so forth. And you see him in Acts chapter 21. He meets with the elders. And the elders have some advice for him that if he followed, they believe would kind of help promote the unity that was there among the Christians in Jerusalem. And of course, in Paul's letter, elders show up in a number of different ways, different places. Ephesians chapter 4, he talks about them being a gift to the church. And so, once more, in that passage, I think what you have is the idea of how important elders were. They're a gift. They're something that ought to be useful for the congregations where they are. He mentions the elders, or rather overseers, as being there with the deacons in Philippians 1. Titus 1, verse 5, which is kind of leading into those qualifications. But he tells Titus that what he needs to do is to put what remained into order and appoint elders in every city. And I take it from that the importance of elders is things aren't quite in order. They're not quite where God wants them to be until those elders have been appointed. That's again, a positive thing for them. Elders were, the qualifications, we mentioned those, they're teaching, and perhaps some of them even being supported there in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Peter talks about it. He gives some instructions to the elders. We'll notice a little later he's also giving some instructions to those that would follow those elders. And then finally in the book of Hebrews, it talks about the value of elders in terms of what they could do for individual members spiritually. In the book of James, you've got them coming and praying for those that are sick. What's nice about this list, of course, is that it takes you through the history of the church in the book of Acts. It takes you through the letters of Paul, takes you through Peter's letter, takes you to the letter that James wrote. Everywhere you look in the New Testament, there's something said about elders and about the role that they were playing. We might ask this question then, so who are elders? So they're all over the place. We read about them a lot, but what can we say about who they are? There are three terms that are used for elders, and you'll notice that in each of these I put kind of a slightly different translation of the same idea. Because it may depend on what translation you have in your hands. All of these terms represent the same office, the same role or responsibility. And I'm going to put a few passages up in a moment, and when I do, without trying to prove the point in a very strong fashion, I think that if you pay attention to the verses that we're going to put up, you'll see these words being used interchangeably within the same verse. We might have 1 Peter 5, and Peter is addressing elders, but he talks about elders being those who were shepherding. So you see the two words being used together in the same place because it's the same role. But you can see in those titles, so sometimes you have the word presbytery. Usually it's going to have to be the King James Version before you'll find that term. When we talk about presbyters, what does that make you sound? What does that sound like to you in terms of perhaps a religious group? And that's the reason they're known as Presbyterians. It has to do with the leadership model that they followed, which came out of that word presbyter, which is really the word we usually refer to as elders. Then you've got the idea of a bishop, or I most frequently will use the English Standard Version as we go through these things. There, it's typically translated overseer, but your version may say bishop, which seems a little odd because we don't think about bishops in the Lord's church, but there are bishops. An elder is a bishop. He's an overseer. He's a shepherd. And that last word, of course, shepherd, sometimes it's rendered pastor. And unfortunately, that word, too, kind of gets caught up in our connotation. There are religious groups that have a pastor, usually, one pastor there, whereas in the New Testament, there was always a plurality of these leaders in an individual church, but there would be pastors. And I know it's interesting every once in a while somebody will come to Embry Hills and say, so, can I meet with the pastor? And somebody will come over and look at me like, well, he's a pastor, you know. But they're thinking something a little bit different in these terms. Here's some places where you'll see these terms being used. So this will help you kind of get an idea of some of those verses, not all the ones we listed before. In 1 Timothy, chapter 4 and verse 14, you have this passage where Timothy is reminded of something that he had received through the laying on of the hands of, well, it depends on the translation that you have. If you've got the King James Version, it'll say it was through the laying on of the hands of the presbytery. The eldership, if you've got the New King James Version, or maybe something like the Council of Elders. What's nice about that passage, of course, is that it allows us to understand there wasn't just one elder there. Wherever Timothy was when this happened, there were more than one elder. We've mentioned Acts 11, Acts 14, 11, monies were brought, given to the hands of the elders. Acts chapter 14, there were elders appointed in every church where Paul had gone on that missionary journey. And then in Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, we mentioned that one as well, kind of putting things in order. What's interesting to me about that, so here's one of those places where you can see how the words are used interchangeably. Titus chapter 1 and verse 5, Titus is told to do this, to give those qualifications, kind of put things in order regarding elders. You go over to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, same qualifications that are listed there, but there it's referred to being the office of a bishop or an overseer, depending on the translation that you have. You've got shepherds. So Ephesians 4 and verse 11, we talked about the idea of, in this role, this is a gift to the church. You have this as something that ought to be useful to you. Well, the word actually is shepherd. Given shepherds to be able to do this. And of course, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 2, it talks about shepherding the flock. That's the responsibility that elders had, to be shepherds over the flock. But in 1 Peter, the verse before that, Peter's referring to elders. So again, you see that how these words are used interchangeably here. Here's another one. This is the Greek word episkopos. I have no idea how to pronounce it, obviously, but that word is usually translated either overseer or bishop. So here's our third one of those different words, and here are some places where you'll see it being used. Does that word, by the way, episkopos, does that remind you of a religious group, perhaps? Episcopal, Episcopal. And it's interesting, as I understand it, one of the reasons why those names for those groups came in is because their leadership model is different from one another. The way that leadership is done within the Episcopalian church is not the same as it is within the Presbyterian church. And so in Episcopalian, you have bishops, and that what they are ruling over is different than Presbyterian. And it's not the same. I have to say, it's not the same as what you're going to read in the New Testament in terms of the role of elders. Throughout most of our study, we'll use the word elders. I think that's what we're most comfortable with. I could spend the whole weekend and talk about the role of bishops. You know, probably just kind of grade at it a little bit. It'd be okay, but it wouldn't feel quite the same. So we'll generally talk about elders or shepherds as we go through this. The question is, what are they to do? What's this responsibility of them? And we'll just put this on right up front. It's important to understand elders are to rule. They have a responsibility to lead. There's some element of authority behind what they are doing. And so that word that's used in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17 in regarding the elders who rule well has to do with standing before them. They are ahead of. They're trying to exercise a degree of leadership. And, you know, there are times when members are a little uncomfortable about that. Maybe even a little bit afraid. When a congregation has not had elders for a long time, and now they're going to be appointed, what often happens is there's this little bit of anxiety about the loss of well, we used to control, or we used to be involved in this, as if all that's turned over. But there is an element of rule that's part of this. But at the same time, a lot of it is implied in what's taught here in 1 Peter 5, verses 2 and 3. I'd like you to open up your Bibles to 1 Peter 5. I want you to help me to kind of understand what's implied in terms of what elders do in this passage. So let's look at this. They are to shepherd a flock. So before we say anything else, just if in this passage he commands them to shepherd a flock, what kind of comes to your mind might be involved in an elder's responsibility if they are shepherding a flock? Protection. Yeah, the eating food, right? And so that fits very well with the way the scriptures are often presented as being like food. So these are good So you see some things that they ought to be involved in: protection, feeding, spiritual food. But there's also this idea that they would do this not under compulsion. That kind of brings anything that comes to mind about maybe not just what they do, but about the whole office of an elder, how somebody becomes an elder. What does that suggest? Maybe the fact that they're not to do this under compulsion. It would imply that they would desire that, which was one of those qualifications. Yeah, Doug. So there must be some heavy responsibilities that come with it. That's another view. A number of things then you could kind of figure out from this passage, just the idea it's not under compulsion. One would be there must be some kind of a selection and appointment, right? That could run along the lines of being kind of pushed into it, but hopefully not. Hopefully a process in which that desire for the office and things came to light, and others were ready and willing to serve with them. How about not for shameful gain? What might that suggest that elders are going to be involved with in some way or another? Land, you might. I mean, there are going to be funds that are likely to be under their responsibility. There is that passage in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that talks about that there are some that are worthy of double honor, some of those that were also preaching and serving in that capacity. And there might be situations in which an elder is being supported. Why are they doing that? So there's a negative kind of under this, not for that shameful gain, but it does suggest that they've got some responsibility over funds. And then you've got this one, not domineering. What might that suggest to you? Out of that negative term, what does it tell you about the work of elders? There could be that, and he's saying don't do that. But if that's a possibility, what does that say? There's responsibility, right? There's some authority. Again, back to that, Peter's very clear about the manner in which they should lead. We'll have more to say about that. It's not this heavy-handed. It's not domineering at all. But it does say that there's an element in which they are leaders. And they are to show that type of leadership. So there's some giving, following of instructions that are in there. There's some other things too. Ephesians 4 and verse 11, the idea of equipping the saints. That's getting them ready. And what follows that? Equipping them for what? Do you remember what it says after that? Work of service, work of ministry. The things that a congregation should be busy in doing. We look to that passage often to tell us what is the work that a congregation or church should be doing. Well, this says that elders are ones who help get them ready to go and to do that. Praying for the sick. So they're leading and making decisions and matters that affect the church, like area of benevolence, which is the implication in Acts 11. Doctrinal matters, we mentioned that. Maybe even these personality issues where you had Paul coming in and they were trying to work toward the unity that would be there. Those are some of the things that elders are to do. And we'll bring to light, I hope, over our studies and discussions even tonight, more of those kinds of responsibilities, things that elders will do. There are responsibilities on behalf of the congregation as well. So look at some of these. I think we could kind of group them into two. One is that a congregation ought to be willing to follow. If elders are supposed to lead, then the congregation needs to follow and to be willing to do the things that they're asked to do by the elders. There are a number of passages that mention that. Look, for example, at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7. It talks about that they ought to obey. Pretty strong word in regard to this. And I will say, we say a lot to those at Embry Hills where we worship. When they first come and they place membership and they're meeting the elders for the first time, we talk about the willingness that ought to be there to be submissive to the rule of the elders. We always kind of add to that, but not in violation of your own conscience. If you find yourself being led by elders to do something that you believe is wrong, you need to raise a question about that. And perhaps you may not be able to follow. You're not being asked to follow to do something that's wrong. In matters of judgment and all, then the congregation should follow what the elders have to say. In 1 Peter 5, in verse 5, it talks about being subject to either the elders or to the elder. That may be a more generic passage about those that are younger following those that are older, but it immediately follows instructions to the elders, and it may very well be about the elders themselves. But I especially like what it says there in verse 6, kind of following from 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5. There's this focus of being humble. And humility is an essential quality that a congregation needs to have to be able to follow the way that they should. But I think the other thing that a congregation needs to do is to assist and join in the work. It's not as if, I think Marty's got a passage or two that'll highlight this as well. It's not as if suddenly you appoint men to be elders and they go and do all of this work and nobody else has any role in terms of leadership or responsibility or carrying things out. Think about Galatians 6 in verse 1. Galatians 6 in verse 1 and into verse 2 talks about some that may fall away, those that are struggling spiritually. Who does he tell should go and help those individuals that are struggling spiritually? Those who are spiritual. In other words, if you have a mindset of striving to serve the Lord and you see someone else is struggling, you have an influence with them, you should exercise it. You should go and do that. That responsibility in Galatians 6, 1 and 2 is a great description of what elders should be doing all the time. We'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But you should assist and join in the work. And there are benefits. There's some great benefits that happens to a congregation. When they have elders, the elders lead effectively. The congregation is following with peace and in unity and striving to do those things. And I'll just mention several to you because I need to kind of wrap up with one last thought that I want you to have in your mind in terms of a definition. Think about some of these things that happen along the way. So you've got an increase, it says, in activities and opportunities. I wonder, how is that possible, that that's the case? Think about Acts 15 again, there where you've got this question, serious question about teaching and about doctrine. It needed to be decided. There needed to be some degree of understanding, of learning, and thinking that through so that those that were there in Jerusalem and others that were leaving from there and going and teaching in different places would have the truth. What a value it is if you have elders who are dealing with new false teaching and have the capability of being able to quickly identify something that's not the truth, to be able to describe it clearly, show the scriptures of what is the truth, and to allow everyone to quickly understand and gain a right understanding of what it is that God wants us to do. Another example would be in Acts chapter 9. Remember in Acts chapter 9, there's a description given of the conversion of Paul. And so Paul becomes a Christian, shows up in Jerusalem. And how did folks feel about Paul when he, still known, I guess, as Saul there initially, when he showed up in Jerusalem? What was the feeling about the congregation, the church in Jerusalem? Has a lot of fear, right? What do you mean? What do you mean he's a Christian? What do you mean he's showing up there? You know who saw that? You know who resolved? Now we know, I think most of us know that Barnabas kind of stepped in. Here's somebody taking the leadership role because he understood the circumstance. But who did Barnabas take Paul to? It wasn't the apostles. That's what's interesting about that passage. He takes him to the elders there in Acts chapter 9. And the elders are the ones who deal with this issue. And so the good part about that is that they had this opportunity to resolve the issue. I know in regard to Paul, should he be a member? Should he not be a member? Is that an important question sometimes for a congregation to kind of think about and to work their way through? I know of a congregation a number of years ago had someone who came to them to place membership. And there was a great deal of disagreement about whether or not fellowship should be extended to this individual or not. And there were no elders there. And so the discussion went on for months about whether or not this person ought to be accepted as a member, to the point that it had a devastating effect on that congregation. Think about how helpful it is to have elders who deal with those sorts of circumstances. Because what they will do, they will make a decision. We should have fellowship with this person, or we shouldn't. Does that mean that everybody in the congregation necessarily is going to agree with that decision? Perhaps not. And if it violated your conscience in some way, you'd have to make a decision about what you would do about it. But think about the peace and the quickness with which that would allow us to know. This is what this church is going to do. We believe it's acceptable, and for these reasons, to have that fellowship with them. And in the case of Jerusalem, they might have debated over Paul for a long time, but with leadership, it came to a decision. And it brought peace among them and allowed them to, you know how much they accomplished going forward from that. And there are other ones too that talk about just the multiple blessings. We've mentioned Ephesians 4. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 5, it talks about elders caring for God's church. Hebrews 13 and verse 17, I'm going to come back to that verse in just a moment. I want to wrap up the thoughts I have this evening by asking you this question. Why is it that churches really need elders? And what you'll hear from the two of us over this weekend, especially those of you that will be in the workshops tomorrow, we'll talk about shepherding. And we'll talk about shepherding the flock and shepherding the sheep. And we'll draw a distinction. What do we mean? What does it mean to shepherd the flock versus shepherding a sheep? Shepherding the flock is leading an entire body of people. It's leading the whole church. And it is an important work. And this comment is not meant to minimize the importance of that, but to say of these two responsibilities of elders, being shepherds of the flock and being shepherds of the sheep, I believe that being a shepherd of the sheep is the one that is of even greater importance. What happens, though, is that our picture of what elders do is mostly kind of wrapped up in shepherding the flock. It's those decisions that they make that affect the whole congregation. Should we expand a building or not? Is it time to restripe the parking lot? Who should our preacher be? What time should we meet? And what teaching programs should we have? And who are the men who are going to come for our gospel meetings? See, those are things that kind of affect everybody. And we recognize that those are decisions oftentimes that are in the hands of the elders. And that's kind of our picture of what they do. What's interesting to me is that without elders, as long as nothing really kind of changes or no big decisions need to be made, you almost get that impression things are just as good without elders as they are with elders. Now, if the preacher leaves and we have to find a new preacher, then all of a sudden we recognize, well, this isn't easy. You know, every member trying to weigh in on that, you see the value of elders. But that's the way we often think of is this responsibility of leading an entire flock. I think the more important responsibility is being the shepherds over every soul. Let me show you a couple of verses, and then I'm going to let Martin kind of take over here. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. As an elder is the passage that to me worries me the most. And I think that almost every time that somebody comes and places membership at Embry Hills, this is a passage that comes up in our discussion with them because we want them to understand as elders what we think our responsibility is to them. Here it says we're to keep watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. That's a scary thing. But elders are concerned about your soul. They want to help you make it to heaven. And so it says even here, let them do this with joy. It ought to be something that is of great benefit to you. Then there's this passage we've talked about, 1 Peter 5, verse 2. It talks about shepherding the flock that is among you. But it says that you are to do that. It then brings in the example of the chief shepherd. My question would be, how did the chief shepherd, who's the chief shepherd, by the way? Christ. What did he do as a shepherd? Well, fortunately we have the book of John. John chapter 10 gives a picture of that. Here's some things that are I'm reminded of it as an elder. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. They know his voice. I need to have a relationship with all of those members in the congregation. I need to know them. I need to know them by name. And that shamefully, people come up and I'm thinking, what's the name of their... And it's not just know them by name. The implication here is he really knows them personally, and they know his voice. I know my own know me. And so that ought to be on the mind of every elder, and it ought to be a benefit. That's the real, to me, the heart of the work that an elder does, is this responsibility. And think about this, in conclusion, what I have to say. Here's a passage out of those qualifications for an elder out of 1 Timothy chapter 3. This is one in which you can kind of get a little bit of what he is to do, not just the qualification, because it talks about caring for God's own church. But before that, it mentions the fact that he has to manage his own household well, else how will he be able to care for the church? In other words, when you look at men who might be qualified to be elders, you're looking to see how did they handle themselves within their own family. What's your picture of a father who's demonstrating that he might be ready to serve as an elder? Is it, when it says manages his own house well, are you picturing someone who just kind of has everybody organized well? Man, their household runs really, really well. Everybody gets up at the right time. They show up at school the way they're supposed to. Everybody's well fed. They always have the right clothes on. And, they march. They have their chores. Is that your picture? Everybody, it's an orderly house. Man, he gets everything done just that way. I think what we understand is that a father who's really ready to be an elder is one who has a relationship with every single one of his children. He knows them. He understands their weaknesses. He's trying as best he can to raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. He's trying to help them to become what they should be. And if we knew of a father who knew 2 of his 4 children well, but really didn't know the others well, didn't have a relationship with them, would we think of him as someone who was managing his household well? That ought to be our picture of shepherds, elders, striving to know every member, trying to help them become what they need to be as they follow.